these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, folks. Another great episode for you, this time on the moral case for capitalism, the moral case against socialism. We're going to get into some philosophy on the free market and on the American founding. And so I found some guy that's got a doctor of philosophy degree in moral philosophy and political economy from the University of Oxford. Great writer, has written a lot of books. We can go through some of them. I guess the most recent, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization. Sam Gregg is his name, and he is with us today. Sam, thanks so much for being on.
Congressman, it's a great pleasure to be with you today.
So you, I gave some of your bio there. You went to the University of Melbourne, and
I did. I'm Australian, by the way.
You're Australian. Okay, that's where the accent's coming from, everybody. You write for National Review a lot. That's where I've seen a lot of your stuff. And I think just recently you wrote a piece on the moral case for capitalism and talking about how we need to be talking about that. And, here's some stats you point out. In the last 2 years, Americans in the 18 to 24 age bracket went from 58% favoring capitalism to just 42% having a positive view of capitalism. What has caused these changes, you think? And I'm a guy who's in politics and talks to people all the time, and it's still not clear to me why they're changing their minds on this and what they think the alternative might be.
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. It's something I think a lot of us are thinking about because those numbers, that decline of people between the ages of 18 and 34, in terms of how they view markets and their increasingly favorable view of what they call socialism is pretty disturbing. Let me just preface it by saying that when they say socialism, it's not always exactly clear what they mean by that. Sometimes it seems to be this sort of general yearning for some type of equality. Sometimes it's about a sense of they believe that socialism is just and somehow capitalism is inherently unjust. I don't think many of them are talking about the idea that they want to replicate something like we saw in the Soviet Union with command economies, and very few of them would say we want to be like Venezuela or Cuba for that matter. But it's I think there's a number of things going on which explain what's happening. First of all, generally in the air, if you go to any mainstream college or university, you hear a pretty relentless beat against capitalism. Mm-hmm. Markets are bad, markets are exploitative, and really the only defenders of markets that you'll find within universities might be in economics departments. So to that extent, those that are going to college, they're hearing a pretty consistently negative message about capitalism. So that's one factor. I think another factor, though, which a lot of people I don't think are paying attention to, is that we can't underestimate the damage that was done to the case for capitalism, the case for markets, by the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession. Now, I could give you, and I'm sure you could give lots of reasons why that crisis and the subsequent recession owed a lot to bad monetary policy, bad housing policy, a lot of bad government decision-making, as well as some bad things that happened on Wall Street. But the point is, it really damaged the reputation of capitalism in the minds of many, many people. So even today, so we're 13 years away from the financial crisis. Whenever I'm talking about a subject like capitalism, this comes up every single time. And I think those of us who favor markets have got to do a better job in explaining why that happened and how it happened. The third reason I think why markets are on the nose, so to speak, among a lot of young people, is that those of us who are fiscal conservatives, we are really good at articulating the case for markets on policy grounds. We can show why free trade works, why closed economies don't work, why free exchange works, why free prices work. And we're really good at articulating economic and policy arguments for these things. The left, I think, are actually very weak in that regard. Where the left are much better is articulating a moral case for their preferred vision of what economic life should be like. Now, the fact that it doesn't work, the fact that, as we know, command economies don't work, as we know, European social democracies have all sorts of problems. But for many people, that doesn't matter. What matters is that people who are in favor of markets are often not very good at explaining what you might call the ethical, the philosophical case for markets. And if you're a young person, young people are idealistic, young people are looking to change the world, young people are more optimistic generally in many respects. They have a vision, a thirst for life, all these good things, and they want to hear idealistic, strong philosophical cases for why they should be this rather than that. And those of us who are fiscal conservatives, I think, generally speaking, don't do a very good job in that regard. So those are some of the things.
And I think one of the challenges is, how do you persuade one of these kind, assume they have good intentions, and I don't think they always do, people advocating for some of these things. I think mostly they want more control and power. But I think the people that they persuade probably generally have good intentions along the same lines as you've just expressed, right? They want to feel like they are kind. They want to feel like they are supporters of justice and equity. Now, they don't think very deeply about what that means or the second and third order consequences of pursuing that goal single-mindedly. So, yeah, they don't want Venezuela, but how do we convince them that your kind rhetoric always ends up in Venezuela every single time? Cubans get so mad about this, and I bring up Cubans because it's a hot topic right now, and they really hate socialism. Every Cuban American has a really bad taste in their mouth of socialism, and they often tell me, we have heard all this rhetoric before. It's exactly how it started, and it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, just because it's human evolution, nothing happens overnight, and so it's a very frustrating thing, and utopia is a very strong and powerful tool, and it's working against conservatives too. Look, you note that approval of capitalism amongst Republicans went from 81% to 66%. Yeah. What do people think is the problem exactly? I mean, now I do think conservatives come at it from a different point of view. I wonder if you use the word free market, Republicans would be more apt to support it. I don't know, but there is a populist uprising on the right that is, I think, normal everywhere outside the U.S., but is new here in the U.S., and I frankly am not a big fan of it. It just kind of makes us it just makes us people that agree with Democrats on economic policy, but we just don't like them, but we're disagree on all cultural issues. So I think it's a problem.
Let me say a couple of things. One is you mentioned conservatives and the way that there's been a decline among conservatives, younger conservatives, about how they view the favorability with which they view markets. I have to tell you, I have spent more of the past 6 years arguing with people on the right about markets than with people on the left. So I've been having a lot of arguments with those people who describe themselves as economic nationalists, you might call them economic populists, etc.
Yep.
And they're reacting against all sorts of things, and there are aspects of their positions I'm not unsympathetic to. But it does seem to me that in many respects, when you drill down and you look at some of the arguments they're making, they're not that different from some of the things that the left is saying about these issues.
They argue based off of resentment. I mean, it really feels like resentment politics. I just don't like that this company or this person is powerful and has more than me. I mean, it's not an objective opinion, because it's not obvious to me that because you're richer than I am, that this somehow takes wealth away from me. But this is the sentiment that many people feel.
Yes, it's a type of zero-sum mentality that if I am wealthy or someone else is wealthy, it means that someone else is poorer. Now, anyone who has spent, maybe a few months studying some very basic economics will soon realize that just because some people are rich does not mean that other people are necessarily poorer. That's a zero-sum mentality that assumes that the pie is fixed. And of course, we know that markets grow, markets increase wealth, and over time, it's the case that more and more people get out of poverty. And the envy question that you mentioned, I think, is also very important because I think it was Alexis de Tocqueville who I think still wrote the most insightful book about the United States back in the 1830s. But he pointed out somewhere else, that even when societies get rich, everyone is always looking up to see who is wealthier than them. So you or I are much wealthier and much healthier than an aristocrat in 18th century France, right? So the if you like, the line by which we judge these things is constantly changing, particularly in America, because the society is getting wealthier and wealthier all the time. So the standard by which people judge these things changes, and it means that people get envious about things that they really have no reason to be envious about either. You mentioned also utopia. That is also another problem because there's a lot of young people who really do believe, and not just young people, I think intellectuals have this problem as well, right, of thinking that you can construct a perfect world on earth, that you can build heaven on earth. Now, this is a temptation that's been going on for thousands of years.
It's very human.
And it's very, very human, and it comes up all the time, just as the envy question comes up. So one of the things I try to do when I'm dealing with these sorts of arguments is to say, okay, I think that if we're going to talk seriously about economics, we need to engage the economic arguments. We need to understand how markets grow, how markets create wealth, how markets have historically gotten millions of people out of poverty at the fastest rate in history. We need to do all that, but we also need to ask ourselves, what type of economy fits the reality of who we are as human beings? And that gets people thinking, because what you realize is that socialism, social democracy, whatever you want to call it, is built upon a vision of human beings that's simply untrue. It's simply untrue. It denies human creativity. It denies human liberty. It denies human individuality. It also assumes that there's some sort of government figure that can know everything that would be needed to know to build the perfect economy that would fit everyone.
It also wrongfully assumes that producers and men are angels in the sense that they will keep producing more and more and more, even though knowing that production and the benefits derived from it will be redistributed. Like so yes. that's just very much against human nature. The fact is that humans operate off of incentives, and if you're not going to get any reward for your work, you're not going to do the work. Like I think that's fundamentally why it fails. I wanted to say one more thing, that I love talking about the resentment problem and the inequality argument, and a really simple math problem sort of highlights it for everybody. Let's say there's two people in society, and one makes $50,000 and the other makes $100,000. Okay, well, let's double both their incomes. Let's increase both of their incomes by 100%, the same increase. So one person will now make $100,000 and the richer person will make $200,000. But also the inequality between them just doubled as well. So is that inherently a bad thing? And see, this is what drives people crazy. The rich got richer. Yeah, but if you look at the last 4 years in America, after the tax cuts, the poor got richer 4 times as fast as the rich, because pro-growth policies actually help the people at the bottom. And we have a ton of data on this. And people just don't know these things. But like you said, we're good at making that's an economic argument, what I just did, and it's a math argument, but the moral argument. So let's maybe go back to that.
I like what you... Yeah, well, let's talk about that, because I try to say that what we need is a sort of, let's call it a moral realism about the human person. So what do we know about human beings? We're individual and we're also social. We are self-interested beings. You mentioned incentives. That's clearly why a lot of people do things. But we're also capable of altruism. We're capable of doing great things, but we're also not God. We are creative beings, and we can use that creativity for great purposes or for really bad purposes as well. We're also free. That's another thing that makes us very distinct. We have reason and we have will and we have all these qualities that make us distinctly different from the animals. So I think when you're talking about economics and economic policy and what type of economy you want, you need to take all those things into account. Socialism doesn't, right? Because socialism denies human liberty, it denies human creativity, it denies the idea that we're really free in any real sense of the word at all. It prioritizes equality as sameness rather than equality before the law. So, I mean, I think that pushing some of those arguments and really challenging the left to say, okay, you say that you're really in touch with reality. Let's talk about what you think human beings are, because I think your understanding of human beings is deeply flawed, deeply mistaken, and it's not a foundation on which you can really think seriously about economic life. If you deny self-interest, if you deny the fact of incentives, you're going to end up in a very miserable state.
So how do you respond to people when they say, well, when you say people are self-interested and you should encourage that, how do you differentiate that from just being greedy and taking advantage of others?
Well, the thing I typically do is say, if you look at the way that someone like Adam Smith, the way he talked about self-interest, by the self, he didn't have in mind this sort of autonomous, radical utility maximizer that does nothing but calculate how they can make more money for themselves. Mm-hmm. By self-interest, he had a couple of things in mind. One is that people do look out for what is in their interests. It's natural that people do that. There's nothing wrong with people asking themselves, what's in my best interest? How can I realize that? That's not greed. That's simply a reflection of looking at our needs and our wants and then trying to realize them. The other thing is that I always point out the self in self-interest. Who is this self? Well, this self is someone who usually comes from a family or has a family. They have interests which are economic, but some of those interests are not economic. They're interested in all sorts of other things besides economic advancement. So in other words, this self is this very complicated mixture of good motives, not so good motives, good behavior, good actions. They have their whole personal history. So in other words, when you think about self-interest in that way, you realize very quickly that this is not greed. And what's greed? Greed is the irrational desire for more of something that you either already have or you're placing so much value upon something, whether it's money or sex or whatever it happens to be. You've attached so much value to it that you've lost perspective of what is really important. Self-interest is very, very different from greed in that sense. Greed is ultimately something that consumes you, it destroys you because you are valuing something much more than you should. But self-interest isn't that at all. It's a very, very different phenomenon. So I think we need to calibrate our language to explain that when we're talking about people pursuing their self-interest alongside lots of other people pursuing their self-interest, and how all these different self-interests come into communication with each other, they enter trade with each other, they enter into exchange with each other. That's, I think, the one way we can talk about this that exorcises this language of greed and greed is good that many people associate with the very idea of self-interest.
Right. So if I were to summarize the argument, the moral case for capitalism, it might go something like this. The outcomes are better for everybody. That is a data-driven fact. It's an undeniable fact, number one. But number two, it is a realistic view of human nature and allows humans to live as humans, meaning people that operate in their self-interest, that freely exchange with one another, and that choose their destiny and, put in American terms, to pursue their happiness as they see fit.
Right. Right. And the economic system, I think that's right. And I think the economic system that fits those aspirations is clearly markets. And you mentioned right at the beginning the American founding. they took this idea of self-interest and this realist understanding of human beings very, very seriously. The person I look to in this regard who thought a lot about this with regard to questions of economics was Alexander Hamilton. Remember, he would say things like, we are not angels. Mm-hmm. Human beings do have a dark side. We can't pretend that human beings are angelic creatures who will never do anything wrong and who will always have this very utopian view of the world. He was very clear about that. He said, no. So there's a whole tradition of thinking within the context of the American founding that takes this realist understanding of human beings very seriously. We see it reflected in the Constitution. I think the Constitution very much reflects this conception of human beings. But it also reflects the way that Americans talked and thought about commerce in the late 18th century.
And I think a key distinction is between conservatives and liberals, because I think liberals would also acknowledge that humans are obviously capable of evil. I mean, they think every conservative is evil. So clearly they think they're capable of it. But here's the big difference. Here's what Hamilton would have followed with. And we know that because, they wrote the Constitution, and the Constitution by definition is a limiting document. It's a document that limits the power of government. And so that's an important point to make, because what the left would actually say is, look, yes, we know people are evil, which is why we have to make them change, and we can. Right. And so it's a collectivist philosophy. It's a centralized philosophy versus a decentralized philosophy. So Hamilton, the founders, conservatives nowadays would say, yeah, we know people are bad. We know they're not angels, but if you place parameters around them, and if you operate off of incentives, you will have the most ideal outcome. Didn't say a perfect outcome, just the most ideal. About as good as you can get, given what a mess humanity is and always will be, because we're human.
Yeah, so, I think what you're pointing to is another reality, which I think makes a very big distinction between the left and the right, not just in America, but everywhere. It's this. The left really do think you can change human nature, whether it's through social pressure, through cultural pressure, through quote-unquote re-education, whether it's through using the state. They really do believe that you can transform human nature. And this is not a new thing. This goes back to this is one of the decisive differences, I think, between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, right? I think the French revolutionaries really did believe that you could change human nature so that you would produce these people who were somehow devoid of all these problems that we know that human beings have. The American Revolution and the American tradition of capitalism and commerce says, no, human nature is more or less fixed. You can be virtuous, or you can be a bad person. You can make free choices for good or for evil, etc., etc. But there are certain constants of human nature that don't change, and you're much better off, whether it's in politics or economics, trying to have a political or economic system that reflects those realities about the human person and tries to turn them towards the good. I mean, this is the insight of people like, say, Adam Smith, right? He acknowledged these realities about human beings and said, okay, so how do we optimize these realities so that we produce optimal economic outcomes for the overwhelming majority of people? The left are not at all comfortable with that language or that way of thinking, because I think it runs straight into what I think is their let's call it their preferential option for social engineering.
Mm-hmm. That's a great way to put it. Okay, let's transition a little bit to something you mentioned early. What would we call it? Economic nationalism. That sort of kind of populist wing of the right. Because I'm gonna quote some of your work again. So maybe not socialism, but just more government, right? Like that. That's kind of the in between. And again, like conservatives like us would say, that's just the next step to socialism, guys, because one thing I usually point out is, look, you can enforce a minimum wage, right? But then less people will be working. So then what's next? Well, you have to make the companies hire the people that aren't working anymore. So just make them do it. Okay, well, now the companies are going under. Okay, fine, then subsidize them. You see how quickly the cascade effect happens because of that first government intervention. So anyway, but my point is people are skeptical of this. You note that 74% of Republicans under 45. That just, I don't know, but this is a crazy stat. 74% of Republicans under 45 support increased spending, even at the risk of higher taxes. That's concerning. I don't know if that's true in my constituents, but I can't imagine them answering that question that way, to be perfectly honest with you. But, but that being said, I think the new strand of republicanism in the populist wing, very happy to get $2,000 checks, for COVID. And I was up in arms about this because those are going out to 100 million plus people that never lost their job throughout the pandemic. There's no reason to believe that these people are in dire straits. They never lost their job. Okay.
Right.
And it turns out we have a system in place for people who did lose their job in the form of unemployment benefits. But even that has turned out to be a disaster here in this country because people won't go back to work because of those extra benefits. So, I guess what's my question here? What's your take on that? Where is this coming from on the political right, and what's the proper place for it? Because I think it does stem from a general anger at corporate cronyism, which is a good anger to have. I think that's a concern, but also international economies and trade and unfair trade practices, and I'm very sympathetic to that.
Yeah, well, as I said to you before, I've spent more time over the past 5-6 years arguing with, let's call it populist conservatives or economic nationalists than I have with the left. And in many cases, as I'm sure you know, many of the economic policies are not that different from what is being proposed by Senator Bernie Sanders or Senator Elizabeth Warren. There isn't really that much difference, whether it comes to things like trade or industrial policy. So where is this coming from? Well, I think the first thing is a lot of conservatives, and I'm sure you see this, are very angry with the corporate sector. Mm-hmm. They're very angry with the corporate sector because, one, they see a lot of cronyism, which is true. It's absolutely there. There's no question about that. They're also, and that has been exacerbated by the unfortunate trend of what we call woke capitalism. Right. So that's another aspect of this which infuriates a lot of conservatives. A third thing is they're looking at things like trade issues and they're wondering, okay, this seems to be hurting parts of America. I don't understand why we're doing this. So there's a number of different motivations. A lot of it, I think, does come back to this issue of anger with the business sector. Now, I always point out to people, well, one of the reasons I'm in favor of free markets is because the freer the market, the less scope there is for cronyism in the first place, right? Because if you remove the ability of either legislators or business leaders to sort of try and leverage regulation to get a privilege rather than going out and competing in the marketplace, you can understand why a lot of conservatives get angry with this. So there's that side of that, and I understand that why they're concerned about that. On the other hand, there's also a trend within this group of people who are literally saying things like, we have this big administrative state. We've tried to reduce it. That doesn't seem to have worked. Maybe we should use it to realize our own purposes. And that I find very, very disturbing because the administrative state, the growth of the administrative state is to be lamented. It's a problem. It should be resisted. The moment we start thinking that way about the state and the role that it plays in our life, I think our claims to be American conservatives start to look very, very shaky indeed. So a lot of it's frustration. A lot of it is this sort of temptation to use politics as a way to get one's way, to use the state to sort of force certain things upon the rest of the population, like the left do all the time. But also there's some bad economics. There's some bad economics as well. Yeah. And that's part of the problem. So, for example, when people say to me, well, manufacturing is disappearing, well, we're deindustrializing, I will say, no, we're not. Manufacturing in terms of its productivity is up way, way, way high since the 1970s. Number of people employed in it has gone down. That's no question about that. But why? Primarily because of technology, which is what you want, right? I think you want people moving away from these often what were very difficult, very hard forms of work and moving into other segments of the economy. So when I hear people say things like, well, the number of people working in manufacturing has declined, that's true. But the number of jobs overall has massively increased since the 1970s as well. So all those people or their children who would have once gone and worked in some of these industries, they're working in the service sector now. They're working in other segments of the economy. And that's what you want. I think that's what you want.
Yeah, the counter argument would be yes, but there's a sense of fulfillment in building something.
Sure,
and like when you are a laborer like that, you do tend to get paid more. So I get that again. Like, but what can you really do about it? Is the question. It really takes the private sector to figure that out. It's hard to see where government comes in. But
as you know, government has a terrible record in this regard when it comes to things like industrial policy, which is the sort of the way that sort of selective interventions into different industrial and economic sectors. Yeah. Right. This is what's been talked about.
But what do you think about so the national security arguments, right? So the libertarian right versus frankly, the mainstream right in this case, but for something like the Jones Act, so protecting our shipping industry. And this is something where, you can get me to be pretty libertarian on domestic politics, but I'm much more in domestic economics, I'm much more sympathetic to the nationalist argument when it comes to international economics, because these other countries are just outdoing us. And this is really bad for us as a maritime power. So let's just stick to shipbuilding, for instance. The Chinese have just exponentially just run right past us on shipbuilding. Primarily because they just subsidize it. To me, there's not really any other explanation for it, and they put a lot of government effort into it. And I think needless to say, we have a huge interest in having a strong maritime industry. We're a maritime power. We always have been, and so what's the right balance there? Frankly, I don't think it takes a ton of money, except for some policy changes and maybe some protectionist policies like the Jones Act. So how do we contend with that?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, I'm very much a free trader. So I have difficulties with protectionism in general, obviously. But I do also think, as no less than Adam Smith said, right? He said, defense trumps opulence, right? So national security is not something you can reduce to economics. You can't be basically reducing questions of national security to issues of trade. There are issues of national security that go way, 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 way beyond the benefits of trade. So, I mean, and to tell you the truth, I don't know many free marketers who would say, no, national security is not important. No, free trade will solve everything. I don't know many people who would say that or think like that. But of course, the devil is in the details. So you mentioned China, for example. They have embarked, especially over the past, 12, 13 years, upon using the state aggressively in the economy to sort of build things like a maritime industry, to try and expand their power through things like the Brick and Road Initiative, et cetera, throughout the world. The difficulty is that a lot of those policies in China are now failing, right? We know this because there are cities that are basically full of no people. The Brick and Road Initiative is building great resentment around the world where it's being implemented, because we know the Chinese are lousy colonizers, and people resent all the political strings that are now becoming more and more apparent about the way that they do this. China's re-centralization of the economy, using many of the policies that you just described, including with regard to trade, is also hurting them now. It's reducing their growth. It's promoting corruption. It's lessening transparency. All the problems that we associated with the command economy that was used by countries like the Soviet Union, etc., all those phenomena are now starting to become more and more apparent in mainline China. So my hesitation about these issues is I always say, look, the Chinese are going down. Let's call it this neo-mercantilist path.
Yeah.
Neo-mercantilism doesn't work in the long term. That's the problem. So when it comes to responding to Chinese aggression, I'm all in favor of that. There's all sorts of things I think we could be doing in different parts of the economy to try and combat what is clearly a hostile power, a power that clearly has designs upon establishing itself as the preeminent power in at least the Asia-Pacific region, right? But we should be very careful before we start implementing policies that resemble something very like what China is trying to do in different parts of its economies, because that's just the general thing with protectionist policies. It's basically a race to the bottom, right? Because protectionist policies hurt us just as much as they hurt those who they are directed against. So I mean, it's not easy because the Chinese threat is real. They are behaving in this way. They're not the only country that behave in this way. I mean, countries like France, for example, have been trying a lot of these policies for a long period of time, and there are negative consequences for the United States in that regard. But replicating those policies, I think, is a little bit like cutting off your nose to spite your face. So, like you, I'm more sympathetic to some of these national security arguments, but I really wonder about some of the policies that are being proposed, because I don't think in the long term they work.
In the end, it does depend on the policies. I mean, I'm sure you've seen Oren Cass's work on this with the American Compass. You know, he really attempts to make the economic intellectual argument for economic nationalism. And it really got down to the details of, okay, there's a lot of rhetoric here, but when you get down to the details of what he's proposing, it actually seemed to be pretty mainstream conservative. You know, it's like invest in workforce training and apprenticeships, you know, things like that. It didn't seem like very extreme policies. And like you said, devil's in the details, and it depends on the issue in particular. I use shipbuilding as an example because it's so important, and it's a little bit ignored, I think. And look, I think a lot of people would, if you ask them the question, like, okay, widget X will cost you more if you don't engage in free trade, or it'll cost you more if you don't do that, and you make it be manufactured here. And are you willing to pay that extra 10 cents, $1, $2, whatever it is for widget X, if it means that there's now a factory in Ohio that employs 1,000 people? You know, and it kind of depends on who you ask.
Right. And, you know, a lot of those policies end up costing a lot of money. The other thing is, as you know, economics always tells us, there's lots of unintended consequences for these things. So let me give you an example. Remember the tariffs that the Trump administration put on, was it steel, in March 2018? Well, you know, it's estimated that those policies saved about 7,500 jobs, but also cost 75,000 jobs. Why? Because all the users of steel in America who are suddenly finding themselves having to pay higher prices for the use of steel. Mm-hmm. So how do they deal with this? Well, they keep their costs down by letting people go or using technology to try and cut their labor costs. That's part of the problem, as I see it, with these sorts of things. There's these unintended consequences. And the way also, I mean, even with the national security issue, which I take very seriously, you probably know better than I do that there are lots and lots of companies that will claim the national security mantle in order to try and extract some sort of subsidy or tariff for which there really isn't a very strong justification. This happens a lot. All sorts of companies saying, well, yes, but our industry, we believe in free trade for everyone else, but our industry is vital to the defense of the United States, and therefore it should receive a subsidy or a tariff. Whenever I hear that, I'm willing to say, okay, well, I'm willing to listen to your argument, but I enter it with a skeptical frame of mind, because I think in most cases it turns out to be not the case at all. Yeah. And what they're really looking for is a privilege.
So let's move on to the difference between social conservatives and fiscal conservatives. Mm-hmm. You wrote about Romney's child care benefit proposal. I'm also on a proposal to that would help for child care by basically allowing you to borrow from your Social Security benefits of the future.
Mm-hmm.
There's another proposal, which I might even like better than the one I'm on, which just allows you to borrow from your future child tax credit. So, but obviously the goal here is to be pro-family, right? This is where the social conservative comes into play here. This proposal for Romney that you wrote about is $250 a month per child between ages 6 and 17 and $350 for children under 5. I don't know if that's means tested or is that just for everybody?
I think it's means tested up to a point, but a very high number. Very high number.
So, it's we're encouraging the growth of the family, which is not a bad thing to encourage. I think one of our greatest threats of the future is an aging population and a population that is not reproducing.
Demography.
So
right.
It's luckily, this is where China, I think, has real big problems. Japan has had that problem for a long time. So, I do appreciate you pointing out earlier some of the pitfalls of China. We always hear a lot of optimism for China. We're always scared of it, but it should be noted that their foundations are extremely shaky. But anyway, how do we address this? What's the right way to talk about this? This sort of divide between kind of the libertarian fiscal conservative and the social conservative.
Well, I'm in the curious position of being a social conservative and a fiscal conservative. So I find myself arguing with both sides depending on who I'm with, right? So I think, I do think, for example, you mentioned demography. Well, demography is, I think, China's big Achilles heel, and it's really hurting them now already. Just think about all those young Chinese men who are never going to have a spouse simply because there aren't enough girls around, right? Or just the fact that how they're going to support an aging population with this shrinking base of younger people. We in America just hit a new low when it came to the birth rate. This is really serious because economic growth tends to go along with population growth. We also know that strong families are really important for all sorts of good social reasons, but also they reduce the call on the state when it comes to welfare. A strong family, two-parent, intact family is the best form of social security that anyone can have. So I'm all in favor of policies that make it easier for people to have families, to grow families, for families to remain stable, etc. On the other hand, when it comes to using the federal government to do these things, I often think this is a bit of a very big stick trying to fix problems that I'm not sure are always easily fixable in a fiscal way. I think, for example, when it comes to the African-American population, one big cause of the undoubted social problems experienced by the African-American families since the 1960s, I don't think it's a correlation that things started to go very badly in that part of our community, family-wise, when the Great Society came along and basically tried to substitute all sorts of existing social and familial structures with interventionist policies in the form of the Great Society. My friend, I don't know if you've ever had her on, but Amity Schlaze, who I think has written fantastically on the subject of the Great Society.
She's been on the podcast.
Well, she's written very well on this subject, and she goes through and shows how so many of these things, these sort of very complex, rich social networks were basically torn up from the ground and thrown away as a consequence of many of these policies. So that's one thing. The second thing, so there's a very long history of the state trying to do things in these areas that turn out very badly. When it comes to some of the proposals that are being made, I just wish if they're going to do these things and do things in this area, I do think that reducing taxes for these families as much as possible is the preferred way rather than giving people stuff. I tend to think that, because here's the other thing, when you give people, say, a child benefit or whatever it happens to be, there's no guarantee that the family will use it in the way that it's intended, right? There's no we can't assume that the single mother with a few children who gets this child benefit. I wish I could assume that the single mother or single father, for that matter, is going to use this extra money in a responsible way. We just don't know that. We can't control that. So my tendency on these issues is we need to reduce the fiscal burden on these families, or on all families really, but these families in particular, because I think that's the way in which you can be most delivering them the help that they need without the state sort of meddling in their lives or trying to push them in particular directions when it comes to the way that they live their lives and the way that they raise their children.
That's why I liked the proposal that we had, which was basically borrowing from what you're already entitled to in the future.
Right. I mean, that, that actually makes more sense to me.
I liked the Social Security one because when I'm retiring, I plan on planning ahead. Like, I'm not going to need that money at age 67, and if I do, like, I really screwed some things up. The biggest indicator of wealth in humanity is your age. If you only know one thing about two different people and it's their age, you can mostly be correct by assuming that the older person is wealthier. And so, it's just broader topic on Social Security. It is a transfer from the poor to the rich, just directly. And right. it's the biggest, it's a huge scam, and we need to get it under control. It doesn't mean I don't want to get rid of it. Everybody listening, don't want to get rid of it. We don't want to throw Granny off a cliff, but we got a lot of really wealthy people collecting Social Security checks, and that check comes directly out of the millennial family that is trying to make ends meet. It is trying to pay higher rent and, trying to pay off student loans. So because we do in actual terms, my generation has much higher costs when it comes to three things: healthcare, education, and rent or housing. And this isn't that surprising. I mean, everybody's like rolling in their graves about the housing thing. I'm like, look, there's a lot more people and we're all still trying to pack ourselves into the same space. It shouldn't surprise us that housing is more expensive. It is a supply and demand issue. Now, you can deregulate a ton of things to make it cheaper. And so maybe that's a policy discussion there. It's like not only just letting you borrow from your own entitlements, but policies that make things cheaper, and that's where we get into the deregulatory regime. It makes things cheap, especially with housing. And, there just seems like there's some things we could do there.
Well, the other thing, of course, is that when it comes to the general pattern that you're pointing to, the thing is that the wealthy, those who are already wealthy, they can afford the cost of the regulatory state. They just have more resources. If you're on the lower end of the income scale, it just simply eats up more of your income in terms of your disposable income.
The same is true for businesses, especially. I mean, a small business doesn't have a team of lawyers and people for compliance, whereas a large corporation's like, regulate it all you want. It's just actually helps us shove away the competition.
Yeah, it blocks people. It blocks young entrepreneurs, young businesses out of the marketplace. I'm actually writing some things on this very topic right now. And one of the things you find is that entrepreneurs, one of the main things they complain about, apart from lack of access to capital, but one of the main things they complain about is the sheer regulatory burden that's encountered by anyone who wants to start a new business. Now, this differs from state to state. Some states are better than others at all this. But what's disturbing is that compared to even European countries, in some European countries, it's easier to start a business than it is in the United States, which is not how it should be, right? Traditionally, it's been exactly the opposite. So enabling people to get into the marketplace so that they don't have this regulatory burden is extremely important. And of course, big businesses, as you say, please regulate us. That's the refrain you often hear. Is because they're not stupid. They're very smart people. They know that the greater the degree of regulation, the less likely it is they're going to have competitors emerge to challenge their position in the economy, whatever sector it happens to be. And this is some of the counterintuitive ways I think we need to talk about some of these issues, because I think when you do it, when you explain things that way and you say things like, hey, look, regulation serves the interest of established big businesses, that changes the nature of the conversation about markets and capitalism right away.
Absolutely. Can we talk about Europe for a little bit? I'm not sure my audience always gets an insight onto what what the policy differences, the philosophical differences are in Europe, because a conservative in Europe is different than a conservative here. You know, a conservative in Europe is generally still very comfortable with the welfare state, comfortable with in Britain, comfortable with the national healthcare system. So it's just, it's not quite the same. But we can learn things from Europe. I mean, as you stated, it's, especially in the Nordic countries, they win out on the regulatory freedom issue all the time in our own studies, like from Heritage Foundation, for instance. They have no minimum wage. You know, they have some really interesting hallmarks about them that maybe we should learn from. And that's what I told the young Democrats that are always saying we should be more like them. Look how great and compassionate they are. Well, it's, maybe we should, and then you should pay 60% in taxes. And they're like, wait a second, wait, what?
Right. Well, let me say a couple of things. One is that when people like Senator Sanders talks about Sweden, I think he's thinking of Sweden in the 1970s. Sweden is in the 1970s is not what Sweden is today. In the late 1970s and really in the 1990s and early 2000s, Sweden and quite a few other Scandinavian countries engaged in significant deregulation of lots of their industries. They reduced their highest tax rates from things like 90% to 60%. Now, that sounds terrible to us, but it sounds pretty good if you're a Swede, right?
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of things that they did. On the other hand, there's lots of other things about what I call European economic culture, which I think are very problematic. One, for example, is that the emphasis there, when you talk to people in Europe, you say, okay, if you have, what do you think is more important? Security or liberty? 9 out of 10 will say security. They'll say security over liberty. And it's not surprising, right? If you've lived through, if you're living in a continent that's gone through 2 horrific world wars, the Great Depression, National Socialism, fascism, communism, et cetera, I can understand why they're a little nervous. They're very anxious to be a little bit more secure. I get that. But that has consequences for the way that economic policy is approached. It means that economic liberty is not prioritized. Economic security through the state is the priority. So many Europeans, including lots of European conservatives, they don't have the same skepticism about state intervention that you find in the United States. Even think about, for example, even the British Conservative Party, the Tories, who do have a significant free market wing. But just think about them. They have a conservative government in Britain with a huge majority. They're going like us, they're going through the COVID crisis. But think about this. The way that they talked about it was all about, we need to protect the National Health Service.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we need
was
to
a
protect
campaign promise.
Right,
They're
right.
adding 50,000 doctors and nurses. I remember it.
Right. And I lived in Britain for a number of years, and I have to say that the health service there is lousy. But if you talk to a lot of people in Britain about it, the fact that it's lousy doesn't matter. What matters is that the state is providing health care.
Right.
So the fact that it does it badly is not important. So that's an example of the very different mentality. The other thing I think which is very different is that when America is very much a bottom-up society, things grow from the grassroots up, and that is very much part of the economic culture of America going right back to the colonial period. In Europe, it's top-down. The state is the point where things are expected to begin. People look to the state to solve all sorts of problems. Tocqueville talked about this when he compared America in the 1830s to the France of his time. He said, in America, when there's a problem, people bring themselves together in associational forms from the bottom up to deal with the problem. They don't go off to their state capital. They don't go to Washington, D.C. to try and fix the problem. In France, he said, someone in Marseille who has a problem with their neighbor goes to the responsible ministry in Paris and tells them to fix the problem.
Right.
And I think that's very illustrative of the difference.
Well,
now, we've moved in that direction. There's no question about
have.
that. We've moved a bit in that direction, but it's still a major cultural difference. Americans are much more willing to take the initiative to deal with problems. You see,
we make a nonprofit, we create a charity, we just want to solve it. We want to solve it now. We're impatient about it.
Right.
Which is a good thing.
As Europeans, it's about the state. The state needs to take care of this. You see a poor person in the street, their response is, well, this is a failure of the state to take care of this problem, not how about you go over and help that person? No, that's the job of the state.
Yeah, it's a totally different question of morality too. When they say Jesus was a socialist, I'm like, no, Jesus wanted you to give charity, not ask, not tell other people to give charity. That's totally different. And also in these presentations that I'll do on this topic, I'll always point out that the UK Minister of Loneliness. Yes, there's a minister of loneliness. Like they literally established a position to address loneliness. It's like what it just really proves that point. It's a totally different mentality of what the government can accomplish. You know,
it also speaks to the weakness of civil society in so many European countries. Whereas here, civil society has its problems here, but it's
weakening,
alive and well. No, it is. It's definitely weakening. The habit of association, the rise of, you mentioned loneliness, the rise of people who don't have many friends, et cetera, the people who are not involved in civil associations, that's all on the down in America right now. But it's still much stronger in America than it is in Europe, despite the problems that exist in America in that regard. And part of it, of course, I think, is it still reflects the fact that America is still a much more religious society. Even though religious practice is down and church participation is down in America, it's still much more religious society than you find in Europe. And Tocqueville noted this as well, right? Mm-hmm. He said most of the forms of association that you see in America, overwhelmingly it's through religious organizations, through churches, through synagogues, whatever. His point was this associational habit is how Americans make liberty work and how liberty doesn't degenerate into this type of radical individualism where people have nothing to do with each other. The habit of association is what Americans have that fix that. Unfortunately, in Europe, that habit of association is extremely weak.
Yeah, it does seem that way. And look, I mean, in the South, at least in Houston, I mean, churches are packed. They're always packed, and there's multiple services. So that I do feel like it's still strong, but you got our younger generation packing themselves into apartment buildings in the cities. You're surrounded by people, but you won't talk to them, and it's it's because like, what excuse do you have to talk to them? And people need to develop that kind of group. So some people join a CrossFit gym, whatever it is, but it's something we have to talk about more. And it's not something that government can just make happen, because I'm asked this question a lot. Like, how do we get the God back into the schools? And, it's like, we kind of just have to win on cultural grounds. And and I've got ideas on how to do that, but I can't necessarily mandate it. It's a dangerous place to go.
Yes. And I also find that there are some conservatives who are sort of using that type of language a little bit to say, well, maybe the state needs to be taking a more proactive role in building civil society. And I always say, no, you don't want that, because when the state gets involved, even with the best will in the world, it is going to crowd out competitors. It's going to crowd out competitors.
And I think the way we did it, if we did it at all, just incentivize it, like reward it. How about don't get in the way of it? It might be a good start. So maybe let's end with this on something you talk about, which is the moral cultural vision of what America is supposed to be. And I think that's it's a vision statement. So like what should our vision statement be? And I like how you put that, because I'm always talking in terms of visions and what we're aspiring to and how we define that. And then let's map out a path towards it. Because right now it seems more and more like people believe that a representative like myself should be offering them something, should be giving them something, because you've quoted Alex de Tocqueville a lot in this episode. So here's another quote from him. The end of the republic is when politicians figure out they can bribe people with their own money. it's a sad truth, and it gets to, again, it's definitely bubbled up on the conservative side too. It's something we've been talking about. So what is our proper moral, cultural vision of what America is supposed to be?
Well, I'll say this. As someone who was born outside the United States, as someone who's now lived in America for over 20 years and who became a citizen of this country 13 years ago, I think I'm like a lot of other migrants to the United States in that I can see things about America that maybe a lot of native-born Americans don't automatically appreciate
You're
as
like
quickly.
a modern-day Alex de Tocqueville.
Well, I don't know about me, but I think it's very common. I mean, you mentioned Cubans and other people who have come here, and their vision of what America is supposed to be really, to my mind, resonates very, very closely with what we find in the American founding, that America is a country that's built upon ideas about human beings, about human happiness, about human life, and human freedom. And there's really, I often say this to people when I'm asked questions, what's the most distinctive thing you find about America? I always say, it's a country that is built on these ideas. There's no other country really like this in the world. So it's this mixture of Judeo-Christian heritage, the good side of the Enlightenment, and it all comes together in this sort of very, very powerful package at the end of the 18th century, and it gives flower to the Republic. I find myself drawn more and more to reading the writings of founders, and they didn't agree about everything. We know that. They did not agree about everything. But there was this sort of common commitment to the United States as a society of free men and free women who are given the liberty to pursue their happiness in the context of lots of other people doing that, and in a way that's very reflective of an appreciation of the realities about who we are as human beings. We talked at the beginning about how many of the founders had a very deeply realistic understanding of human beings, but they didn't see that as something that was going to mean that life was going to be short, nasty, and brutish. They thought that this was something that you needed to build upon and appreciate in order to build this republic in which liberty and virtue go together hand in hand, never apart. Liberty and virtue. And again, that's something you hear the founders talking about again and again and again. And I think in America, part of the problem is we have, and this is not just on the left, but on the right, a lot of people talk about liberty. A lot of people talk about virtue. Very few people bring the two together and understand how they have to balance and reinforce each other. They're a republic in which people are free, but they're also free to pursue this better version of who human beings are meant to be. That's my vision, at least as someone who's come from the outside. And I think that's something that is very reflective of human reality, American history, and the aspirations, I think, of lots and lots of people who come here seeking that type of society.
Yeah, people don't come here for our welfare programs. I mean, they're impossible to navigate, first of all. But, and I like that. And by the way, that essence of America is found in a lot of our symbology, too. Look at the Statue of Liberty. She holds the torch of freedom, but it's not just freedom for freedom's sake. It's not like do whatever you want. Because in her other hand, she holds the tablet of law. And inscribed on it, it's actually our Declaration of July 4th, 1776. And I think that has a lot of meaning to it because I think the Declaration designated the purpose of government for us, to protect your inalienable rights, protect your right to pursue happiness. But within that protection is an understanding that you can only really be free. You can only trust people with freedom if they are morally good and that they adhere to some sort of long-held virtues, timeless virtues. And those virtues can only really be derived from Judeo-Christian history. There's no other place. It's why we have "In God We Trust" on the House of Representatives above the Speaker's chair. And it's why Moses is the single picture. There's 23 lawgivers that span the House of Representatives on the ceiling. But Moses is the only one who's centered and looking down at the Speaker, because the 10 Commandments are true. In a very fundamental way, they're true. You can't argue with them. And you have to have that anchor of morality in order to live in a society that values liberty.
Right. And so part of the issue we have right now in a lot of America is there are many people who talk about liberty, but without connecting it to that deeper history and that deeper moral code, which really goes back and ultimately goes back to the Hebrew people, right? I mean, this is where there's no mistake that you find people like Washington quoting the Old Testament over and over again because they took this side of things very seriously. So we need people to understand that freedom is not freedom to do whatever the heck you want beyond all reason, beyond all laws of civilized countries. But we also need people who understand the importance of virtue, to understand that you can't be virtuous unless you make the free choice to be so. It's impossible to be a good person unless you freely choose to be a good person. And I think that's part of the divide that we have in much of America today. The other thing I will say is that what you just described in terms of the people looking up and seeing the different statues and seeing people like Moses, etc., if you look at the American founders, the text that they cite the most, if you go back and look at all those people who are founders, the text that is most cited is not John Locke. It's not Montesquieu. It's not even people like Blackstone. It's the Bible. It's the Bible. It's something like 38 or more percent of citations made by founders is to scriptures, the scriptures. That tells you something about how they understood the republic to be. They did not want a theocracy. They did not want state and church being locked together. But they did believe that religion played a major role in shaping the way that liberty would work its way out in this new republic. Tocqueville noticed this right away when he first came to America, because he came, of course, from France, where religion and the world of religion and the world of liberty were at war with each other. He comes to America and he says, hey, what? They're not guillotining each other?
Yes.
They're not locking each other up? What's going on here? This is different. And I think that's something that even if someone is not a believer, they can still appreciate this particular role that religion has historically played in America, and why we ought to be worried about the decline of religion, particularly among younger Americans.
And that's absolutely right. I mean, even if you don't believe in God, the Bible is the quintessential morality guidebook. And it does inform a lot of the ways we think about due process, neutrality under the law, fairness, equality. It's packed with it. It's why our founders referenced it so much, I imagine. I'm out of time because I got to go take some votes. So and we're at an hour anyway. Sam, thanks so much. That was a great podcast. I think the listeners enjoy it immensely. Can they find your work anywhere else, or what would you like to say to end it?
I just simply go to the Acton Institute's website, acton.org, or go to the Heritage Foundation, where I'm a visiting fellow, and they'll find many materials that I've written there as well. But thank you for having me on, Congressman. It's been great to talk with you.
Thanks, Sam. It was excellent.